we want to encourage a broad discussion of the climate crisis. That will include climate science and climate policy. So if you have issues, concerns, views you want to check out or discuss with others in the room or with Elizabeth, be prepared, because the bulk of the evening is going to be back and forth between us and amongst us. So I'll first, before we start, we're on Treaty 4 territory, and I'd like to welcome Elder Sandy to do an opening prayer.
Hello, my name is Greg from Standing Buffalo. Ask you see what you come say a prayer before the start the session. So I'll make everybody to stand up. Volkanta Kartakashina, Qu'Appelle Watershed, Qu'Appelle Watershed, Makoshi, Ushna Qu'Appelle, Watershed. Each one was 50 chocolate, Watershed, also state that's what should be affected. And was the team just done, Chapitakashi, Ushna Qu'Appelle. Hoje é que o lixo não tem uma piada, mas things are going to the whole way. I'll be talking about. Thank you.
So my name's Jim Harding. I'm one of the directors of the Qu'Appelle Valley Environmental Association. We grew out of the local Kairos, which has been active here for 15 years on the water issues. The other directors are here: Randy LaBelle, Lorna Evans, Greg Van Leuven. So some of you will know who they are. It's an open forum, a respectful forum. We hope we will listen and learn, and we also hope that this can be one small event on the planet that starts us moving, because I think those of us who follow the climate science know that time is not on the side of humanity at this point. Every place people live, watersheds, wherever on the planet, there are people who are becoming aware that the whole human race has to shift directions. It's hard with the political and economic structures. It's hard with the ideological structures. Somehow we have to break through that and start to see the changes occurring on a faster basis. Elizabeth has a strong background on the science, on the international agreements, and the politics, because she's a member of Parliament for Sandwich Gulf Islands. She's the leader of the Green Party. She has a long experience in government policy, environmental policy. So we're very pleased to welcome Elizabeth as the one and only national leader who accepted our invitation. And I'll turn it over to Elizabeth.
Thank you. So I want to begin by thanking Jim for the very lovely introduction, and to Elder Sandy Magwitch, thank you for welcoming us to territory. This is certainly a place that speaks of Treaty 4 territories. We're gathered here together in a modern and very impressive space, reflecting the traditional Plains tradition of teepees. This is really cool, and I'm very happy to be here. I also want to acknowledge, before I begin, that I see a lot of old friends, but I'm looking around particularly for one of them. Where did he go? Lauren Scott's here someplace. Yeah, I couldn't find you. That was sneaky over there. But the thing about it is I wanted to say, now you all know Lauren Scott as your former environment minister in a Democratic Party government. I first met Lauren when he was a card-carrying Tory. And he, as a farmer, it's not your fault, it's not your fault. A lot of what I want to say tonight is that this issue of environment, but more climate, isn't and should never have been made a partisan issue. It's a non-partisan issue. But when I first met Lauren, I was, speaking of non-partisanship, I was the senior policy advisor to the federal Minister of Environment in Brian Mulroney's majority government, which isn't something that people look back on and say, oh, those were the days. Brian, Neela, how I miss them. I'm afraid I do, because in terms of environmental policy, that was our Valhalla. That was the best we ever had. We didn't know it at the time. Anyway, as a non-conservative, I was recruited by the Conservative Minister of Environment. And the thing that brought Laura came in to see me as a card-carrying Tory and farmer from Saskatchewan to talk to me as others did, because I was the one policy advisor. It was a great title, senior policy advisor. There weren't any others. But anyway, I was the one person in the Minister of Environment's office whose job was all the environmental issues. And this is the Minister's office, of course. Environment Canada was filled with brilliant people doing water policy, acid rain, climate science. I'll come to talk about that. But of course, the issue that Lauren came to see me about was the threat of the Rafferty-Alameda dams. I think the Rafferty Dam, unless I've gotten backwards, the Rafferty Dam was in Grant Devine's riding and the Alameda Dam was in Eric Bernstein's riding. It was a shame when Eric Bernstein went to jail, hey? But anyway, never mind. I'm putting myself on a bad foot right off the start. But Lauren ended up, of course, quitting with Conservatives when the Rafferty-Alameda Dam got approved without any environmental assessment. I resigned my position in the minister's office when the law was broken on that issue. And we were both vindicated when the Federal Court of Appeal ruled that the permits for the Rafferty-Alameda dams were illegal. It's very rare that if you're going to, feel it on principle, you have to leave your job. It's the rare time that the Federal Court of Appeal agrees with you. In any case, that's reflecting on a time when things were quite different, and that was the one time things, well, obviously, if it had gone wrong earlier than that, I wouldn't have stayed as long as I did. I had an extraordinarily good 2-year run working in a majority progressive conservative government. And I want the story of climate science and climate action politically from that period and bring us forward to now. Because I hope what I can leave you with, and would have left my friends with had they been able to come. By the way, I sit next to Max Bernier. So I know that he actually got the invitation and had a previous engagement. I can't account for the others. But anyway, Max is my, literally my seatmate in Parliament. You can ask about that later if you want. So, back in the mid-80s, climate science was not debatable. I say that really firmly because it wasn't debated. We were in a period where there was the beginning of what? We had Ronald Reagan in the White House. Now, of course, Ronald Reagan wasn't an environmentalist. Brian Mulroney, believe it or not, was. Brian Mulroney went head-to-head with Ronald Reagan to get a treaty on acid rain. And we think that the idea of people saying ludicrous things about issues without regard to science might be new, but Ronald Reagan claimed that acid rain was caused by ducks. So I'll leave that alone. But Margaret Thatcher, okay, we don't think of Margaret, again, I don't think anyone's saying, oh, we miss Margaret Thatcher. But Margaret Thatcher had a background in science. She was a chemist. So Margaret Thatcher, as Prime Minister of the UK, did not doubt climate science, not one bit. She put in place the East Anglia Climate Research Unit at East Anglia University. She was determined that we actually would see climate action, and so was Brian Mulroney. So I thought I'd start with the results of the first global scientific conference on climate, which Canada hosted Now, there were many smaller conferences. There was the National Academy of Sciences in the U.S. had their own private meetings. Scientists around the world met and discussed the science. But the first meeting with a real effort to educate the public, to have an international gathering of scientists to which the media was invited, was a conference in the last week of June of 1988 in Toronto. And the title of it, and I helped organize it from the minister's office, but it was co-hosted by the World Meteorological Organization, the United Nations Environment Program, and the Government of Canada. It was opened by two prime ministers, the Prime Minister of Norway, Gro Harlem Brundtland, and the Prime Minister of Canada. And the scientists gathered and discussed all the aspects of climate science and what it would mean for humanity. And then they issued a consensus statement, and I'm going to read you the first sentence. Okay, this is a consensus statement in an era of governments like Thatcher and Reagan and Brian Mulroney. It was this, quote, "Humanity is conducting an unintended, uncontrolled, globally pervasive experiment whose ultimate consequences could be second only to global nuclear war." Now that wasn't debated. It wasn't debatable. Those were the facts. And we went from that conference in Toronto in June 1988. Canada played a pretty significant role right off the bat in working with the same agencies, the World Meteorological Organization and the United Nations Environment Program, realizing that unlike Margaret Thatcher, very few politicians have any science background. And the science around the climate crisis, while not debatable, at that time we didn't call it climate crisis, we called it global warming or climate change, but we recognize that it's the ultimate multidisciplinary science. You've got people who are mathematicians working on climate modeling, you've got people who know the physics, who are working on triangulation of satellite data to figure out whether the gravitational pull is changing, and that means that when you look at the Antarctic ice sheet, the mass of ice is melting. They do it through physics and satellites. Or it can be the people who are marine biologists who are suddenly noticing that the coral reefs are bleaching. Or it can be people working in, goodness knows, for the forensics of climate science, the people who do paleontoclimatology. People, and that's what actually the East Anglia Centre that Margaret Thatcher ended up spending a lot of time doing things like trying to find tree rings from different parts of the world, going back as far as they could, or data about tree rings that were kept by earlier generations, or even, I read through all their emails at the time their emails were hacked, and they had people who were trying to figure out, because you're looking for data, right? Scientists weren't keeping records of absolutely everything going back hundreds of years, but to figure out the kind of the forensics, the paleontoclimatology, they would look at things like fossilized snail shells. What did that tell us about the climate at the time? Or one fascinating bit was a whole bunch of records kept by the UK Navy, because they had cannons on deck, and they had to prime the cannons with water from the seawater, and they took the temperature of the seawater before they used it, because it affected, I don't know what, the gunpowder? That part I don't know. But I do know that they actually had to recalibrate the temperatures of the water when the British Navy stopped using leather buckets and switched to wooden buckets. So scientists are really stretching their brains to figure out exactly what does that tell us about changes in seawater temperature. So this is complicated science, but not debatable. So that's when they set up the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which gets called the IPCC most often, where governments around the world agreed to appoint scientists they regarded as their best scientists from every country around the world, so that these scientists could go through all published research. It's gotten to the point of tens of thousands of research papers that all of the IPCC has to read, decide which levels of research have reached a point of significant confidence levels. So anything dodgy doesn't make it into the report. It's an inherently conservative scientific body. So the IPCC was set up in 1988, right after the conference we had in Toronto. And then there was a big push that we needed a treaty to reduce greenhouse gases, to deal with the climate emergency, which wasn't yet an emergency, to deal with climate change as a threat. And we had an opportunity then to actually avoid where we are now. had we acted on the recommendations of that June 1988 conference, we wouldn't be talking about the issues I have to talk to you about tonight. But the scientists were given the instruction to prepare reports every 4 years, because there's so much science to digest that by the time we hear about it, some of the reports are really old and already out of date. But in any case, it's been a monumental effort to communicate science to politicians and do it in ways that are completely small c conservative, which means they underestimate the extent of the threat and overestimate how much time we have. That's the nature of the IPCC work. So we go forward to getting the treaty signed and ratified. Again, we're still in an era of Brian Mulroney and also George Bush now in the US. So the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was negotiated between 1990 and 1992. And I know a lot of you will remember the Rio Earth Summit in 1992. It was at that point the largest gathering of heads of government in the history of the world. So on a stage in Rio, committed to signing this legally binding treaty, we're still working under it, it said that human releasing of carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases created by the burning of fossil fuels and exacerbated by loss of forests was a major global threat, and we had to act on what human-caused, or in UN language, anthropogenic climate change. We had to act on it before it could reach a level that became dangerous. And the word dangerous is actually the word used in the treaty. So that was the challenge. And also adapt to those levels of climate change, which are kind of baked into the system, which we can no longer avoid. Because when carbon dioxide is emitted from the tailpipe of our cars, it has a lifetime in the atmosphere of 100 years. So most of the climate change we're experiencing now doesn't come from last year's emissions or this year's emissions. It's a buildup of emissions over the last 100 years. But particularly sad for me is realizing that when we negotiated that treaty in 1992, I was so optimistic. Now, one reason for my optimism was experience. I've been working in government when we negotiated a 50% reduction in sulfur dioxide emissions in Canada and the US to avoid acid rain. Now, acid rain wasn't that big an issue for the prairie provinces, but it sure was for eastern Canada. We had lakes dying, and I was from Nova Scotia. We had rivers that didn't have fish because they become too acidified. That was a big deal. And we had to take on, as I mentioned, Ronald Reagan, who thought acid rain was caused by ducks, and we still got it. Based on, largely have to say, Ronald Reagan never got the science. But he and Brian Mulroney kind of bonded, and when they sang When Irish Eyes Are Smiling, Ronald Reagan looked into his eyes and thought, I have to do something about acid rain, or something like that. But it wasn't, from Ronald Reagan's point of view, it was really friendship-based. But Canada understood the science. Canada played a lead role in the next big issue we took on, which is another reason I had confidence we would handle this. We were threatened with the loss of all life on Earth from the deterioration of the ozone layer. The ozone layer was being attacked, assaulted by what we had thought was a benign, genius chemical, wonderful scientific development, chlorofluorocarbons. The science cheered for these things because they were so stable, they never broke down. So DuPont was one of the lead chemical companies to perfect chlorofluorocarbons. So this is fantastic. You can even use them in aerosols to deliver anti-asthma medications deep in the lungs because these things don't break down. You can use them to blow styrofoam. They're fantastic. They don't break down. And whatever like that, you can use them in your refrigerator and they'll keep things cold. Anyway, they've been a miracle product. You know, we've had a lot of these miracle products we later regretted, like DDT or nuclear weapons. But anyway, never mind. On ozone layer, we were suddenly aware of the fact that these things don't break down at all till they reach the stratosphere. And when they break down, one molecule of ozone could gobble up 80,000, right, one molecule of chlorofluorocarbon, rather. One molecule of chlorofluorocarbons could eat up, like, kind of like, I always visualize a kind of a comic book Pac-Man molecule. They could gobble up 80,000 molecules of ozone. So anyway, the ozone layer was thinning, but, you know, by 1987, and again, this is Canada in the lead because we negotiated in Montreal over some significant obstacles that I could talk about later if you're interested. We negotiated the Montreal Protocol, which has, in fact, saved the ozone layer. The ozone layer is repairing itself. We stopped damaging it, and we're not now talking about the big increase in skin cancer across Canada because we failed to deal with the collapsing ozone layer. We saved it. So I wasn't so worried. I figured, okay, this is great. We're together in Rio in 1992, and every leader, I'm on a stage from George Bush to Fidel Castro. Quite a little family gathering. And everybody says, we mean it. We're signing a legally binding treaty to reduce greenhouse gases, and we're going to have to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels, and we're going to have to do it. Well, we didn't have any targets or timelines in that treaty. Our target was, we need to do this before it becomes dangerous. Well, I think we blew that, because it's dangerous. But through a period of years, and I'll just give you some of the international legal lingo, every time a country signs a treaty and then also ratifies it, that country is called a party to the treaty, party. And so the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change from 1992 was not a document that just got to sit on a shelf. Think of it as creating an ongoing climate parliament, if you will. Because every year since the treaty entered into force, because it took a certain number of countries to sign and ratify to kick the treaty into force. By the way, Canada was the first industrialized country to sign and ratify, and we did it within the calendar year 1992. We were the first country to sign and ratify the Biodiversity Convention from Rio and the Climate Convention from the Rio Summit. So every time, once the treaty entered into force, there's been an annual gathering called the Conference of the Parties. So you've probably heard the term COP thrown around, COP this and COP that. That's a gathering of all the nations that are within the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which to this day includes everybody, includes the US, includes Canada. And so the Conference of the Parties that took place in 1997 took place in Kyoto, Japan. That was COP3. And that resulted in the Kyoto Protocol. It took a long time for the Kyoto Protocol to enter into force. It entered into force the same year that we also had to negotiate under the terms of Kyoto, its successor treaty. That was a really tough negotiation that happened in 2005 in Montreal. And again, even then, Canada still had a claim on global leadership. We convened that negotiation. It is true it was really hampered by the government of Canada falling on the opening day of the negotiations. So November 28, 2005 was when the Conservatives, New Democrats, and Bloc brought down the minority Liberal government of Paul Martin. So we're in negotiations, and delegates from around the world are showing up and thinking, what happened to Canada? Was your government has fallen? All the hotel workers in Montreal went on strike on the same day, just to add to the general sense that people weren't sure whether it was a good idea to have this negotiation in Canada or not. But our Minister of Environment at the time, federally, Stéphane Dion, told the delegates on day one, I am not a Canadian politician now. I work for you. I'm the president of this COP, which the chair essentially, and all I'm going to do is work on this. Well, I'll speed up from there because that was a really good negotiation that set an ambitious goal, which was that we would find the agreement to replace Kyoto, bring in all of the countries with meaningful targets, and we would do it in 2009, just 4 years away. And that was a disastrous meeting that happened in Copenhagen, in Denmark. It was COP15, and it was a train wreck of the worst kind. So the global politics of this running alongside the science has always been clear, but the politics have gotten worse. So how did that happen? Well, if you go back to the Rio Earth Summit, one of my friends who was also native of Saskatchewan and one of the most brilliant environmental policy global diplomats, I don't know if any of you knew Jim McNeil personally or know of him, but Jim McNeil was also a colleague of Al Johnson and Tommy Shyama and worked for T.C. Douglas and was an extraordinary person and one of my dearest friends. But Jim always said that at the Rio Earth Summit, the Carbon Club formed. So while I was learning climate science at Environment Canada in the late 80s, nobody was saying that there was any doubt about the science. The myth of doubt was invented after Rio, after the convention was signed, and a lot of the large multinational oil companies, and this isn't my paranoia, this is all established by Access to Information reports, they went to the very same public relations people who came up with the campaign for the cigarette industry to say, well, you've got to create doubt about the science. So once the Surgeon General in the United States said smoking cigarettes causes lung cancer, remember how we suddenly, well, some of you will remember, most of you too young, but there used to be TV ads where doctors would take a long thought and say, well, I think smoking is good for my patients. They were paid well. But anyway, that was the same strategy used by the fossil fuel industry to create a debate that wasn't scientific, it was public relations. So that brings me to where we ended up in the Paris negotiations and what the Paris Accord is about and where we are right now on the science, because it really matters to know what the scientists are warning us. In Paris, in COP21, so oh my gosh, I was thinking about the fact that when I went to the Rio Earth Summit, my daughter was not yet 2. Yeah. And what did I say? She was not yet 1 year old. She was born in 1991. I brought my infant daughter with me to the Rio Earth Summit. Brian Mulroney would say, my gosh, you have a beautiful baby. He didn't like me much then, but he thought I had a beautiful baby. I think about the progress my daughter has made. She was not really walking well yet at the Rio Earth Summit. Now she's working on her PhD. So, in the length of time when we should have done something, we went in the wrong direction. We haven't done what needs to be done by even token measures. Since 1992, at the Earth Summit, till today, more greenhouse gases have been between the Industrial Revolution and 1992. In 1992, at the Earth Summit, and I can remember David Suzuki saying the same thing, well, this is the turnaround decade. Because the Berlin Wall had fallen, the Soviet Union had collapsed, we thought we're not going to have to spend so much money on the Cold War missile race. We can have a peace dividend, and we can do things to address global poverty, and we can, we didn't get the peace dividend, we didn't get action on climate change, we did get a profound shift in the relative powers of international actors. Multinational corporations got more power, governments got less. And this was directly in relation to something that was going on at the same time that we were busy negotiating and environment ministers were busy negotiating the climate negotiation. Same time, same governments, but different ministers were busy negotiating the Uruguay round in the GATT, which led to the creation of the World Trade Organization. So between 1987 in Montreal, when we negotiated the Ozone Protocol that I've mentioned as a very successful treaty, the Montreal Protocol included penalties and enforcement mechanisms. And to this day, if any country that's a party to the Montreal Protocol were to violate its terms and start manufacturing chlorofluorocarbons, every other country on Earth could apply trade sanctions against them. That's the penalty mechanism in the Montreal Protocol. It's only 10 years later, 1997 in Kyoto, and the trade ministers around the same tables as their environment ministers said, you can't do that anymore. There were no rulings. It wasn't against any global trade law. But Canada went to the Kyoto negotiations with our Minister of Environment saying, if there are enforcement mechanisms in the Kyoto Protocol, there are trade sanctions, Canada won't sign. So that was one big shift that happened in the 1990s. Where did the peace dividend go? Where did the turnaround decade go? So back to where we are with the science. By 2015, at the Paris negotiations, the big question was, will this treaty aim to hold global average temperature increase to no more than 2 degrees Celsius above what the global average temperature was before the Industrial Revolution? Or will we be more ambitious and work to hold it to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now, these numbers sound trivial to a Canadian. In terms of temperatures, we go through, we have plus 30 days in summer, minus 30 degree days in winter. I won't mention wind chill. So you can say, well, what is 1.5 degrees? What is 2 degrees? What can it possibly really matter? And it matters a lot because it's not a statement of tomorrow's forecast. It's a statement of global average temperature. It's a big planet. And as we all know about, you can drown in bodies of water that have an average of 1 foot. Depends on where your big variations are at the edges, what the average means. So in terms of global average temperature, if you compare the global average temperature on planet Earth now to 10,000 years ago when we were under several kilometers of ice in an ice age, the difference is 5 degrees in global average temperature. So 1 degree is really big. And we've already changed the chemistry of the atmosphere to such an extent that we are stuck with at least, we're stuck with more, but right now we're 1 degree Celsius global average temperature above what we were before the Industrial Revolution. In Paris in the negotiations, we were very fortunate that it's really weird about the science and the politics of all this. I can say it really makes a difference what country is hosting, and as it may have been evident, or you might have inferred it from the way I spoke with Stéphane Dion, it really matters who's the chair of the meeting, whether they do a good job. And in Denmark, Prime Minister Rasmussen did a terrible job. I can only conclude he did not want to succeed. But in Paris at COP21, the former president of France, a man named Laurent Fabius, had done a very strong job over a period of time building up support for a more ambitious treaty. And this was a moment when I was actually really proud of Canada again. I was part of the Canadian government delegation. Again, I've been going, by the way, just for giggles, I'll tell you that as a member of Parliament elected in 2011, and that was when Stephen Harper's government got their majority of seats with a minority of votes. And traditionally under Mulroney, under Paul Martin, under Chrétien, going back as far as you can imagine, opposition members of Parliament were included on the Canadian government delegation. But Harper didn't want to do that, so no members of Parliament other than Conservatives were on the government delegation. But of course, I still wanted to go to all the negotiations, so I could either go and get registration to get in the room as a non-government organization person with the Global Greens, because there's an association of Global Greens around the world, so I could get a pass through Global Greens. But those passes don't get you into all the rooms, because sometimes the heated negotiations, nose to nose, happen in rooms where if you're not a party, if you're not there with a government, you can't get in the door. Well, my government wasn't going to let me get in the door. So for the first COP it took place in 2011, and I went to the 2011 COP, which was in Durban, South Africa, and I got a party badge because I went as a member of the delegation of, I'm now going to forget, that's terrible, I can't forget the delegation I was in, Papua New Guinea. Yeah, so I was in Papua New Guinea for one of the COPs. A little later, I was with the delegation of Afghanistan. Ban Ki-moon saw me and said, "But you're a Canadian member of Parliament." I said, "Yes, but I'm an environmental refugee." So I was once again back to COP21 in 2015 in Paris. I was really proud again to be, if you're a Canadian member of Parliament, you like to go to a UN meeting with a badge that says you're with Canada. It's a good feeling. So at COP21, I was there with my government, which meant I had access to Catherine McKenna. She was brand new. Bear in mind our election had been in late October. The negotiations are in December. We're negotiating whether the text should say that our goal is to hold global average temperature to 2 degrees or to 1.5. And I won't tell you all the backstory, but I was so proud because Catherine McKenna made Canada the very first industrialized country to say, we have to hold to 1.5. And then all the other countries came along with us. Part of my underlying thesis here, which is why I sprinkled this with stories of when Canada was in the lead, is that if we choose to be in the lead again, other countries will follow us. This is an important thing that we tend to forget as Canadians. We have people out there trying to either trivialize or minimize what our role is in the world. Say, oh, well, we're less than 2% of global emissions, so why should we do anything? Well, because if we do something, other countries will follow us. And since we're talking about survival, it's rather important that we do something. So where we are on the science, first we know that the Paris Agreement, through Canada's leadership, says the goal of this treaty is to hold global average temperature increase to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius above what it was before the Industrial Revolution. And then it goes on with some weasel word language, or at least as far below 2 degrees as possible. Because at Paris, there was a real live debate. Is it too late to hold to 1.5? Is it doable, given what we've already unleashed? Now, for the low-lying island states of this planet, they want to hold to 1.5 because anything above 1.5 means they are permanently submerged. They lose their country, they lose where they live, they become refugees. It's also important to hold to 1.5 because losing the Arctic ice has a massive impact on destabilizing climate systems around the world. So why were we in such a, all of us across Canada, different pockets were worse than others? We were in a polar vortex deep freeze this winter, and it was because of global warming. So you're always going to find somebody who says, well, hey, Trump said it. I'd like some of that nice old global warming right now. I'm pretty cold. Well, buddy, global warming caused the polar vortex. The winds around the Arctic have weakened because of the warming ocean waters, and because of that, the polar air has shifted south, and there are parts of Europe that are colder than parts of the Arctic right now. This is a climate change impact. But in Paris, even knowing that there was this debate about 1.5 and 2, the negotiations had 2 documents created. One is called the Paris Agreement, which people talk about. The other was called the COP21 decision document, recognizing that the Paris Agreement was expected to come into force by 2020. It's a really great thing it came into force earlier. But for every bit of action that needs to happen before 2020, there was this other document that said we have to do these things right away. And one of them was, get a really serious study from, as I've mentioned, this cumbersome, conservative, international body, the IPCC, and get them to tell us what is the difference in impacts for the planet between a 1.5 degree level of warming and a 2 degree level of warming, and tell us, is it still possible to hold to 1.5 degrees? And the IPCC was also instructed, give us this report by 2018 in time for the 24th Conference of the Parties so it can inform the discussions. So that's why on October 8th last year, the IPCC report, a special report on 1.5 degrees Celsius came out, and it said really clearly, we have to hold to 1.5. This isn't a choice that we can make politically. Somewhere between 1.5 and 2 degrees, we cross a threshold where we unleash what some scientists call runaway global warming, others call hothouse Earth. We trip into something which becomes unstoppable, irreversible, self-accelerating global warming. And that's because we have things called positive feedback loops in the system. So I've referenced some of them without mentioning what they are, but certainly as warmer water melts Arctic ice, the Arctic ice has always been, as long as it's been there, exerting something that scientists call the albedo effect, which means the sun's radiated heat strikes the ice and bounces back to space so it keeps things cool. Not just in the Arctic, but around the world it regulates temperature and climate. So the more warm water you have coming up from the Pacific hitting the Arctic ice, the more the Arctic ice retreats and melts, the more dark ocean water is exposed, and dark ocean water sucks in the heat. And then it speeds up the melting of the ice. Another positive feedback loop, which is obvious, and those of us in British Columbia who had 400 forest fires this summer, hundreds of fires 2 summers ago, there's obviously a real health impact from that. But another impact is that as forests burn because of climate crisis, they release more CO2 because the trees have been storing carbon dioxide through photosynthesis, so that's a big pulse of carbon to the atmosphere to speed up the warming, to speed up more forest fires. These loops are really dangerous. And the IPCC, and scientists have seen it for some time, there's a point at which if we don't act soon, we won't have anything in human technological ability to do to make a difference to ensure we stabilize global average temperature increase at a place where this very hospitable biosphere, which has allowed human beings to move from being a fairly insignificant species wandering around on 4 legs to wandering on 2 legs to becoming a civilization, to becoming the dominant species on the planet. All of that has happened where the biosphere has been hospitable to us. And we are ourselves changing things to where it will not be hospitable to us. The other thing the IPCC said, so it's really important to know, they said you have to hold to 1.5. The really good news is they said, and you can. We can. As a species, as a series, as governments, they said we do not need to invent any new technology. We have all the technology we need. We do not lack for science. It's not like we can't figure out the chemistry, the physics. There's no scientific barrier to holding to 1.5. No technological barrier. No economic barrier. He said the only thing we are lacking is political will. Now that should be something we could find when we're being told, if you don't act soon, and it's not 12 years, and I'll back up and explain why it's not 12 years. If you don't act soon, you could be putting not future generations as in 100 years from now, but children alive today will not live out their natural lifespan in a hospitable world. Our kids, our grandkids. So that's not, to me, that's not a subject for partisan debate. That requires everybody to pay attention and do what's right. So the IPCC report came out on October 8th, 2018, and they said we have to reduce by 45% against 2010 levels by 2030. And some people thought, well, that's great, it's 2018 now, so we have 12 years. Well, let's put it in months. When the report came out, we had 144 months. We now have 139 months, and nobody's done anything. The reality is to get to the kinds of reductions in greenhouse gases we need to meet, which essentially means we're not playing a game of incrementalism. We're not tweaking around the edges. We're saying we're going off fossil fuels. We have to be 100% off fossil fuels by 2050, and we have to be substantially the way there by 2030. Work backwards from there and say, well, when do we need to start to make that kind of change? Yesterday. Daniel, I want you to remember what I said earlier. This large scientific body, with all their reports reviewed and approved by governments, including, by the way, Saudi Arabia and the United States, gets weakened as it goes, so they are never exaggerating, quite the opposite. So I pay too much attention to social media, by which I mean I read things on Twitter, and I can't tell you how many comments I've seen from people saying, well, these people always cry wolf. These people always say the sky is falling. No, actually not. These are scientists appointed by government, and they tend to underestimate the risk. They're right about it when they say we're going to lose our glaciers. Yeah, we lose our glaciers, but faster than they predicted. When they say we're going to see sea level rise, we see sea level rise. But again, their predictions are based at this point solely on the fact that warmer water occupies more space than colder water. They aren't taking into account in any of their predictions yet, or projections, what would happen if the Western Antarctic ice sheet were to disintegrate, or the Greenland ice sheet were to disintegrate. Either one of those events means 8 meters sea level rise. They haven't factored that into their science yet. So when I look at this, I know that if we have 139 months left, we can't wait till the next election. We have our election this fall. But we can't wait for politicians to make promises to do something that they don't do, and we talk about it again in the election in 2023. By the election by 2023, we have to have been substantially changed course with really good plans and really exciting programs that make everybody say, well, I want to be part of this. This looks great. We're going to move to solar energy. We're going to democratize energy. We're going to be able to say that the jobs that used to be in drilling wells are in taking those same wells that are sunk in the ground and converting them to produce geothermal energy. We're going to be taking the same folks that are busy tearing the dirt out to get to the bitumen to go back and repair the landscape. And we can still talk about producing bitumen for a while more, but not that much longer. But we sure should be finding or we're exporting it raw. We should be refining it here and using it in Canada and so on. But we really don't have time, and this is really bad luck for my friends behind me here who aren't here. You know, it's not their fault that they entered political life when previous generations of politicians have ragged the puck for so long that there is no time left, right? We're in overtime. There is no time, we're in overtime. And so we have to do what needs to be done. And we have to talk about it honestly, clear-eyed, and we have to act like grown-ups. Because our kids are depending on us. So that's what I want to say by way of opening. We have every reason in the world to do what needs to be done. And we have every possible talent, skill, capacity, resource to have Canada once again be in the lead. We could be the country that goes to the next COP, which will be, gosh help us, COP 25 in Chile, saying we just got through an election, climate change was our #1 issue, and we are now as a country committed to doing more than the IPCC has asked of us, because we know they move slowly. We are prepared. We have Rotary clubs across Canada signed up for tree planting. We have church groups across Canada planting neighborhood gardens. We are ready to bring into effect an electric vehicle charging highway across this country so that anyone can get from Vancouver to Halifax in an electric vehicle and never worry that they're going to run out of charge. And we're going to have our electricity grid 100% renewable. We're going to do it by 2030. We're going to be running on solar and wind and geothermal, and we're going to have storage of excess electricity, if not in lithium batteries, such as I just toured the Kawasis hydro and solar facility just outside of town here. But we can also store a lot of energy in old quarry sites. Any abandoned pit can be a water battery storage for renewable energy. We don't lack for anything to make this happen. It's going to be a really exciting time when we all say, right, all hands on deck, we can do this. Where do I sign up? I want to put a solar panel on my roof. Who will let me do it? I want to be able to make sure my house is 100% well insulated so that we don't waste a penny of energy. Where do I get some assistance to bring in a heat pump to my home, an energy efficient furnace? Show me where I sign up. Where can I plant trees? Give me a hand here. I think of it as being a massive national community effort, mobilizing Canadians in a way that we haven't been mobilized since my parents' generation in planting victory gardens and fighting fascism in Europe by saying, we don't give in. It may look bleak, but we're prepared to put our shoulder to the wheel and do everything we can. I know there are people here from House of Prayer. Please pray. I know we can do this, but we have to be prepared to move mountains. And sometimes the mountains are in empty chairs. So I'm happy to open the floor to any questions, challenges, comments you will have. And I want to particularly thank the Qu'Appelle Valley Environmental Association for creating this unique opportunity for me to raise really tough issues with probably too much science and too much international policy wonk talk, for which I apologize. But if something I said didn't make sense, there are no stupid questions. And if you don't believe me about climate science, please feel free to come and to share why, because this is a conversation we've got to have. Thank you so much for being here.
Simple process. If you want to get up again, you can do that after the other people who want to talk have finished, just to be fair. So who wants to? If you want to ask a question and be on the live streaming, this is going across the country, folks. It matters. There's 2 mics back there and they want you to sit.
If you have any mobility issues and you don't want to walk back to the mics, if you sing out your question, as they say in Newfoundland, I will repeat it so the people watching on computers can see it, I can hear it. But if you go back to the mics, it saves a little time. But if you have any issues that you'd really like to speak from your seat, we'll make a note and I'll repeat the question.
So don't be shy. There's 2 mics back there. Go ahead. Yes.
I get concerned about the electric vehicle solution and just our reliance on electricity, even if it's green. Just to a lot of the EMFs that are coming off it, because we are at 80% water, and we do know through physics frequencies affect water. So I wonder about how that is on human stress levels and health. And there's also consideration of our animal friends and brothers and sisters who suffer greatly in casualties due to our vehicle or travel, and I don't think that'll stop when we have electric vehicles. And there's a cost in the production of all of these, which is felt by others in third world countries, and this is solely for our convenience.
Yeah. Well, let me just back up and say quickly that I will not discount that there are scientists who are concerned about electricity. Most of the scientific health concerns, this is a really interesting thing, I just quickly checked to make sure I remember her name correctly. One of the scientists who just co-wrote a paper that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine that climate change is a health emergency. And her name is Dr. Chris Eby. She's at the University of Washington, and I happen to know her. I first knew Chris Eby through the cops, and she was working for the electricity industry, and they wanted her to do studies that would prove that living under high-tension wires didn't increase leukemia. And in her epidemiological work, in her studies, she wasn't sure. She didn't think she could say it didn't. So she shifted from being an industry researcher to being a university researcher. And her studies right now are that climate change is the largest health hazard we face. So in your concerns about electricity, let me put this to you. Where there is science that supports the concern about high tension wires, it's based on a model of the production of electricity which has been uniformly applied around the world, that you have a really big mega project here. Maybe it's a nuclear plant, maybe it's a coal plant, whatever it is. And then you have high tension wires that run across a long distance to deliver that electricity to people's homes. We will have a health impact that is positive, even relating to your concerns, by having democratized electricity so that people have solar panels on their roofs. They're not under high tension wires. People have the access to wind energy in a community. I'll give you the example of Denmark and how you democratize energy. In Denmark, and you may have heard that in Ontario, when the previous Liberal government in Ontario decided to go with wind power, they put wind turbines in places where people didn't want them. Denmark avoided all that by having the wind turbines owned by communities. So cooperatives, small towns, owned their own windmills. They were making money, so they had all their own electricity that they needed, plus they were selling it. Now, where do you sell wind energy in Denmark when you are going to blow the grid, right? If all the wind energy in Denmark that they currently have ready to roll, on a windy day they blow the grid. So they have to sell the excess. They sell it to Norway. Now this is brilliant. Norway takes the excess wind power from Denmark and stores it by pumping water up into existing reservoirs. That's what I meant about using empty quarries and making them into batteries for gravity storage. You know, but the distance between Denmark and Norway isn't nothing, but this works really well. So they pump the water up into a reservoir. When Norway needs electricity and the wind isn't blowing in Denmark, then they open the sluices, they get the benefit of a hydropowered waterfall, and then they pump it back up when the wind is blowing in Denmark. So there are a lot of solutions here that don't imply, actually, we've been using electricity for a very long time in our society, we're dependent on it. I want to make sure that the electricity, when I turn on my light or flick on my TV, is coming from a green energy source. And I love the idea, and friends of mine on Vancouver Island are already doing this. I've got friends who've got sunny enough spots where their homes are located that the solar panels on their roof not only cover all their electricity and heat needs year-round, they charge their car off the same, and their car essentially becomes a battery for excess solar from their roof. This is not dangerous for, like, I mean, not to say dangerous. I don't know why so many people are more intensely frightened by taking action on climate change than by not taking action on climate change, because what it looks like in the future is very cool, quite exciting. More access at a lower cost to our heating, lighting, and cooling, and we control it ourselves. Certainly we've had, I remember in summer of 2003, I was still in Cape Breton, when we lost power for half of Canada, well, Ontario, Quebec, and the Atlantic provinces, not counting Newfoundland. So we lost power for Ontario, Quebec, and the Maritimes, plus a whole bunch of US states. Do you remember that? Ralph Goodale, our own Ralph from here. Ralph went on media and said it sounded like what had happened was an accident in a nuclear reactor. That was the first comment from the government of Canada. It turned out it was a rogue tree branch in Ohio, because Bush had cut back on maintenance of electricity lines. How could anyone in a modern industrialized society design a method for delivering electricity to so many places that millions of people could lose power because of a tree branch in Ohio? This does not sound like a modern system. The solar, wind, geothermal, cogeneration, in other words, taking the waste heat from one building and preheating the water in the next building over. All of these things are at levels of, number one, they're cheaper right now than coal. They're available. Canada's falling behind in the world because we're not investing, we're not developing these things. But they're not a move backwards into the caves like some of the people who are opposed to climate action want you to think. It's really healthy progress to move off fossil fuels. So the next questioner is there.
Hi. First off, thank you for coming here, and thank you for all the years you've been sounding the battle cry and pointing out that we need an effort on the order of world wars in order to combat this problem. Two questions. One is, could you please talk a little bit about jobs? Because I think a lot of people are scared about jobs, and I think we've got a good story there, and if you could talk about that, please.
Yeah.
Second question is, for those of us who do want to make a difference, what do you have to say to the people who are afraid that if they vote the way their hearts want them to vote, that they're going to split the vote and fall and we get something worse?
Yeah. Well, okay, first question first. By the way, battle cry reminds me, I've mentioned Cape Breton a few times now. My brother is a Gaelic activist. Imagine anything more hopeless than being a climate activist, being a radical Gaelic activist to keep the language alive. But my family really knows how to go for the winners. Anyway, my brother in Cape Breton once told me that the word slogan, we all talk in politics about our slogans, slogan sounding exactly like that is Gaelic for war cry. So when you say there's been a war cry and a battle cry, I know it's another slogan. So the jobs issue, it's real. I mean, right now we're shutting down coal mining and coal plants. We have to. We should have a 100% renewable electricity grid. I know the Saskatchewan government's prepared to make progress. They're prepared to move for a 50% renewable electricity grid. That's half as good as we need, but it shows some progress. So what do we do? There are going to be, actually the story for Canada in terms of demographics is that we're heading for a worker shortage, not a job shortage. Much of the population is retiring soon. I'm at the tail end of baby boomers. I was born in 1954. I am constantly talking to employers who can't find workers. And this is true sector by sector by sector. The mining industry is desperate for mining engineers. Airlines are desperate for pilots. I could go through it sector by sector. How many people come to me saying, can you help us get temporary foreign workers because we can't fill these jobs in Canada? So I think the jobs issue is writ large a red herring. But if you happen to be working in a coal mine, it's not a red herring, it's real and it's personal. So we need to ensure that everybody has a guaranteed income at the level of what they're earning now while they choose the next thing they want to do. Some of it is dead easy. I mentioned that the oil wells that have been drilled, that are now orphan oil wells, can be converted quite easily to geothermal sources of energy. And the people who will know best how to maintain those are the oil drill rig workers who drilled them in the first place, will need to maintain them as a place. Because when you dig down deep, in case anyone's wondering what kind of magic I'm talking about, when you dig down deep, you get to hot water. The heat in the earth, when you dig deep, that's where you get your geothermal. Now you can do geothermal for house designs that are, 1 meter down. You can get decent geothermal. But if you want a heat source that creates a lot of geothermal energy, an abandoned oil well is just the thing. So there are some that have already been converted in Alberta by a Dene community, Chief Leo Crowchild, I believe is his name, who's taken a couple of existing orphaned wells and wondered would they work for geothermal, and yes they do. So the numbers of jobs and the places in which we will find those jobs are not imaginable in their entirety from us now, because heck, when I went to university, I didn't think anyone could ever be a software engineer because I didn't know what software was and nobody did. So it's hard to anticipate the careers of the future. But there's going to be a ton. And one other place I should mention, because I've talked to a lot of the trades and the unions for carpenters, United Carpenters Workers, plumbers, electricians. The 30% of greenhouse gases in Canada come from leaky buildings, our built infrastructure. Institutions like universities and hospitals, commercial buildings, homes. We're wasting money every year as individuals and as businesses, heating the outdoors in the winter, cooling the outdoors in the summer, because our buildings are leaky. It will take, according to the unions I've mentioned, 4 million workers to get at all the buildings across Canada and make them energy efficient. It's a great project. It pays for itself. It reduces greenhouse gases. Another big sector in our economy that wants this to happen is all the DIY, do-it-yourself, Rona, home hardwares, all those retailers and wholesalers really want the government to bring back those programs which were for residential and expand them to institutions and commercial. Because boy, that stimulates the economy, and not in one place, everywhere, all at once. Now Saskatchewan has a slightly different profile, actually very different profile, because of how much your energy sector creates greenhouse gases. You know that right now per capita, Saskatchewan is the worst it's the worst greenhouse gas per capita emissions in Canada, even worse than Alberta, is Saskatchewan. But it's not because the citizens of Saskatchewan are particularly wasteful, it's because potash, oil and gas, and the oil and gas industry is particularly polluting because they're not capturing what get called fugitive emissions, the escape of methane while they're producing gas, the escape of methane that they could capture and stop having it vent to the atmosphere, makes this a highly polluting province. But it is all avoidable, it is all, you could handle it all. You could reduce emissions a lot just by ending the venting of methane to the atmosphere, which happens more or less by accident. So the jobs issue really matters, and we need to actually list the kinds of jobs we're going to need, like in the trades, and say, you know what, we're not going to be able to do this with the paid workers who want the jobs. Yes, we'll take everybody, but we're going to need a lot of volunteers too. I see this as kind of model on Habitat for Humanity. Get a bunch of skilled trade workers who can supervise smart volunteers who have some experience in construction, because we're going to need everybody, and it's going to be a ton of jobs, and it's going to take a long time. The second question you asked about people who want to vote green and are worried about the strategic voting, which is one of the reasons that First Past the Post is such a perverse voting system is that you can have a minority of the votes and a majority of the seats, and then you have 100% of the power, as Stephen Harper did in his day with 40% of the popular vote of the 60% of Canadians who voted. So think about this. In the 2011 election, and also in 2015, if you formed government based on what citizens actually did with their right to vote, as opposed to how they actually voted, both times we would have had a majority government of the We Stay Home Party. Well, so put that in perspective. So now in 2019, I couldn't be happier with the fact that we have all of these parties. We've even left out the Bloc Québécois. The parliament that forms after the October 2019 election will, for certain, have 6 elected parties represented in the House of Commons. That means that it's very likely that there will not be a majority for any one of them. So with the vote on the right split, thanks to Maxime Bernier and the People's Party, which will run candidates in every riding across Canada, they won't get a big percentage nationally. But if they get between 2 and 4% of the popular vote, that means that the Conservatives under Andrew Scheer cannot form government. And we will have to get together, and those chairs that are now in a row will have to go in a little circle, and we'll have to have a huddle and decide who should form government. And as long as there are enough elected Greens in the room, because we do believe in public service, we'll make sure whatever party gets to choose who the Prime Minister is, we will insist on certain conditions before that happens. Otherwise, because we're pretty hardcore on the climate front, we'll say, okay, so just go back to the polls. That's the difference between Greens and all the other parties. The other parties would not make a threat like we have to go back to the polls if we don't have anyone ready to form government, because they want to fundraise before the next election. They always, remember how often when Harper was in a minority, somebody in one of the other opposition parties would prop them up so that they wouldn't have to have an election before they'd done their fundraising. We won't do that. So we have to be serious. We don't want to go back to the polls right away. Canadians don't want us to go back to the polls right away. We have to put the public interest first. But if you want to form government, we want to see your climate plan, and it must include a plan to ensure that no province and no profession and no workers are left behind as we make this really big leap to a much better world. So sorry for such an incredibly long answer, but you did ask 2 questions in my defense. So back to, yes, the lady there.
Hi, I have one question for you. What do you do when you love your province with all your heart and you see a train wreck coming and you do not know what to do? Premier Scott Lowe announced today $5 million for C&D. They will remove all but 10% of the wetlands in most of Saskatchewan. Our Saskatchewan government just became in the business partnering with one of the biggest ag drainage projects this province has ever seen. We are draining all but 10% of our wetlands, which is the very thing that is going to save us. And what do you do when you see a train wreck and you don't know what to do?
Thank you for the question. I'm unaware of what it was that Scott Moe just announced, so forgive me for that. But wetlands are critical in climate science, and we were just yesterday, I just met with the University of Regina professor, Dr. Carrie, does anyone remember? I've got her name in my purse. I'll look it up in a minute. Carrie Finley, yes, thank you. Carrie Finley is doing work on the ways in which even dugouts in the prairies are significant carbon sinks, particularly if they're highly alkaline. So we need to protect wetlands, we need to protect them for biodiversity, we need to protect them for a million reasons. One of the things that I felt terrible about when Stephen Harper did was getting rid of the Prairie Farm Rehabilitation Board. This is a learning from the Dust Bowl era. Protect your hedgerows. Prairie Farm Rehabilitation Act really mattered. Harper got rid of it. We're heading for an era that'll make the Dust Bowl look like a picnic. We have to remember why it mattered to keep hedgerows, why it matters to keep our wetlands, and why the prairie landscape has to, and land use patterns have to respect the ecology of the prairies, particularly because they're going to be under maximum stress with increased drought. So and shelter belts, yes, thank you, Jim. We have to, all of those elements of responsible stewardship of the land need to be revisited because we're going to need them more than ever. And by the way, if you really love your province and you really love your country and all of us do, and you see a train wreck happening, speak up, write letters to the editor, go visit your MLA, go visit your MP, and show up to support support, by the way, I hadn't mentioned this yet. This Friday, March 15th, in front of the ledge in Regina is the school strike group. They're going to be there, and go to support them. And you could bring a sign saying wetlands are carbon safe. You're going to be there, aren't you? Yeah. Here you are.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah. I think it can be turned up a bit if someone can. There you go.
Because all the renewables that have been mentioned by you tonight, we're missing hydrogen. And hydrogen is probably the thing that's going to save us as a planet, because we can make it out of electricity. And we can get the electricity from the sun and the wind, and we can do it out of seawater. And if you use hydrogen, it's got almost twice as much power per kilogram as does steady fuel. When you finish burning it, and you use it in heavy equipment, when you finish burning it, you get pure water vapor, which will be very drinkable as soon as you condense it. So what I'd like us to see, and the reason I'm talking is because I don't know how many of the people in this room understand how important hydrogen is going to be. You can burn it in an internal combustion engine. You just have to make a modification to the fuel tank.
Exactly.
So my question is, do any of our governments, in your opinion, understand this? That this is that
What I would say is not really what the question is governments understand. This is one of the frustrating things for me as someone who I know all these guys personally. I'm really good friends with Justin Trudeau. I'm developing a good relationship with Jagmeet Singh. I've known Andrew Scheer for ages, and I would have said we were friends until recently. He got a bit titchy with me when I asked if there wasn't a Maclean's magazine award for Hypocrite of the Year. That turned out he minded that, but I thought it was appropriate at the time. And then there's my buddy Max. Well, we're crazy about each other, but we don't agree on a single thing. So what they understand is different than what they're prepared to do. So I apologize to you for ignoring hydrogen. I'll tell you why. I see hydrogen as a delivery mechanism, a way of transmitting energy from other sources. So I don't describe it as a source like solar and wind, geothermal, tidal, or hydro. Because you can, as you said, you can make hydrogen from any of those things. And then you've got a way of transporting energy. There is a quite brilliant, there's a company in my riding called Empire Hydrogen, which has developed an absolutely elegant, brilliant system that can go on the back of any of the 16-wheelers, big transport trucks, but any large truck, not any car, but they're economical for trucks. Because you can put on the side of the vehicle a converter that captures the exhaust from the vehicle, and with distilled water and pulling aside the hydrogen, runs the hydrogen back in so that you go farther on less gas and you have a much smoother ride, and the truck drivers love it. So we can do a lot more with hydrogen. You'll recall there was a time when, before we talked about electric vehicles being the big winner that I now think they are, there was a lot of thought about Ballard fuel cells, and that fuel cell vehicles would be in the lead. I think there's still a really big role for fuel cells, but more in, say, stationary situations like apartment buildings run off of fuel cells. But hydrogen definitely has a role, and there's a lot, and there are a lot of innovators working with how we make hydrogen, deliver hydrogen, and use hydrogen, because we will be using hydrogen. And as you say, when you combust hydrogen, all you've got left is water vapor. So thank you for raising it, and I'm sorry I left it out. So over to this side. Push that little button that makes the mic red. That's it.
Okay. So the question I have relates to how do we reach and inspire the people that aren't here. Okay, so I'm assuming the people that are here there have spent some time learning about science, know quite a bit about the issues. A whole bunch of people voted for Donald Trump who, I think there's a certain people associate themselves with what they believe their interests are or their values are. And I think a certain number of people in society are just selfish, just want for themselves. And voting for Trump in a way is like saying, okay, this is a justification of my selfishness because he's the president, for crying out loud. So there's a certain proportion of the population we're going to have trouble reaching unless we can convince them that their self-interest lies on our path, right? So you talked about the jobs. Then there's a whole bunch of people that have hearts, that care about their communities, that care about the future for their grandchildren, and they seem really quiet, compared to like the truckers that are going across the country trying to convince that we need pipelines, right? That this is the path forward. This is where prosperity lies. Anyway, so what I want to get at is, I think a lot of people would care if they thought it was possible, if they thought that the kinds of solutions that you've been discussing are real. How do we get to them? Electric car rallies, alternative technology demonstrations. Anyway, guys, so I'd like to hear from you. Maybe you're seeing a different thing, like there's more people than I'm aware of that are mobilizing, rallying, and buying the technology, installing the technology. But it just seems like we should be able to convince them that this is the right blueprint. By the way, I love your platform. Like the Federal Green platform is amazing. You guys are rock stars. So I'm hoping that we can find a way for everyone to know that. How do you communicate to get the people to listen to it? I'll tell you, I'd like to just tell a quick story here about, I was at a Brandy's in Regina, and my friend wanted to buy something at Brandy's, and she got shopping, and so I went over to the clerks, there were two clerks, and I said, well, what do you think about climate change? And they looked at me like, what, you're kidding? I said, no, I'm a climate change activist. I need to be able to talk to people who aren't climate change activists. So can you tell me what you think about climate change? And she looked at me and she said, well, something's wrong with the sky. I don't think anyone's going to do anything about it. I think we're screwed. So I don't like to think about that. So we were talking about a computer game that I was playing last night. Would you like to hear about that? Okay. So anyway, how do we inspire her to believe that there's hope, that she can be part of the solution, and how do we get those people that have hearts, that care about the future, to rally together to shut down the bullies like Trump and the fossil fuel companies that are financing how do we inspire them? What's the slogan?
Yeah, boy. Well, thank you more than I can say, not just for bringing that here to us tonight, but for being the kind of person who goes to shop clerks and says, what do you think about climate change? That's a lesson for all of us. To talk to the people who are cutting our hair, to talk to the people at the grocery store line, what do you think about climate change? Because her answer reminds me so much, so forgive me if it'll look like a non sequitur what I'm going to tell you about, but I've been getting very deeply into historical research. I mentioned it about the way our parents' generation dealt with the Second World War. There's this fascinating period in terms of public morale and public opinion in the UK in the period of time before Churchill got to say, we will fight, right? We will fight in the bush, we will fight, we will never surrender, right? Before he said that, they were getting ready to surrender, right? And I think probably a lot of people have seen the film Churchill that was recent, maybe you've seen the film Dunkirk, but I always try to figure out, right, where is there a historic example of what we need right now that we can point to? So obviously climate change isn't in any way like Hitler, but human behavior and our natural way of responding to something that's overwhelmingly scary, I don't think that's changed that much over the generations. So I've been reading up on, there's a wonderful book by Martin Lukens, who's a Yale University historian, and I think the title is 5 Days in May, London, 1940, or some variation of that. And he did an amazing job, because I mean, really, when you think about it, and I had this conversation actually with David Suzuki, we were at a Kinder Morgan protest last spring, and David has twin grandkids right now, and he has spoken of this publicly, so I'm not giving anything away. He'd literally been standing over his grandkid's crib and he couldn't stop crying. So, because he was thinking, we let it go too late, there's nothing we can do. And I said, no. And I said, so think about Churchill, right? And the second one, the facts, he was saying, well, look at the facts. How's there any hope here? I said, look, Churchill was told, the entire British army is stranded on a beach in Dunkirk. We can't get to them. There's no way to rescue them. The waters, the beaches there are too shallow. The UK Navy can't reach them. The famous British Navy can't get those men out. They're under the Luftwaffe watch, so the Germans are going to blow up anyone who comes to get them. The Luftwaffe and the German army is less than a day's march from wiping them out. And by the way, under Neville Chamberlain, nobody put any defenses on the British Isles so they could be invaded easily. We're going to get knocked over. There's going to be a German invasion. And the nations of Europe are falling like dominoes. Belgium, Poland, and then France, where the soldiers are stuck on the beach. And then to add to that, the US isn't going to help. They call FDR, no help there. So what on earth would make a person have hope in those circumstances? That's why they actually started sending emissaries to Mussolini to see if Mussolini could talk to Herr Hitler to get a good deal for the British Isles, so they might be able to be allowed to continue to have a fake government while they were under occupation or whatever they were going to get for good terms. Now, in this period of time, and I'll go back to what it was Churchill did, so I won't forget, but in this period of time, every single day, the British cabinet was getting, not public opinion polling, but they got something called the morale report. What's going on with the British public? How are people feeling right now? So if you were in modern polling terms, if you polled the British people what they thought was their biggest issue, they wouldn't have said the threat of Nazi invasion, or I don't think they would have. But the morale report said people are increasingly fatalistic. Women in particular have stopped listening to the wireless, they reported. And then this wonderful historian was looking at the diaries of key people in that era. Cecil Beaton, who was a photographer to the upper classes, said the aristocracy is completely fatalistic, they've given up. Meanwhile, working class Brits lined up, and in a 24-hour period, 500,000 showed up at their local police stations to say, where do I sign up to defend the island? So you have all these different segments of society and how are they reacting. My favorite part of all this was what happened after Churchill got his brilliant idea. Where it came from. There may be some book of history that I haven't found yet to explain what it was and if it was in fact Winston Churchill, but as far as I can see, it was Winston Churchill who asked, how many civilian boats are there in Dover? Whoa, there's a concept nobody figured out in the military. 861 civilian boats in Dover. Well, do the math. There's 200,000 people trapped at Dunkirk. Who among us think, we know it happened, so that kind of prejudices the way we think about it, because it actually historically happened. But 861 civilian vessels, we're going to ask amateurs, civilians, non-military people. They're the ones who are going to cross the English Channel and rescue, well, they ended up rescuing 220,000, I think 560 soldiers, English, French, and Canadian. About 120 vessels were sunk by the Luftwaffe. But even with that, there was 1,000 people in terms of loss of life, 220,000 people plus the entire British Army rescued. They rescued the army. So then Churchill could say, we will fight. We're in a war now and we will fight. And what was interesting about morale was a comment in the diaries of one of my favorite theologians, having mentioned faith earlier, C.S. Lewis, who of course most people know as the author of the Narnia books. But C.S. Lewis was also a theologian. He wrote his diary after Dunkirk, after the rescue, and now we're at war. And C.S. Lewis wrote his diary. It's amazing to find, whenever I run into someone I know, how much more encouraged everyone is now that things have gotten so much worse. Because what that shop clerk said to you, something's wrong, I don't like to think of it, I think we're screwed. Our job as political leaders, or as individual citizens, all of us together, I've said, okay, what's the 2019 equivalent of 861 votes in Dover, right? What can you do from your vote? What can I do from my vote? Well, we can plant trees anywhere. We can plant gardens anywhere. We can say to our government, we are sick of you being in the way. Will you please give us solar panels so we can please put on all of our roofs, while we also turn abandoned oil wells into geothermal, while we also convert our vehicle fleet away from internal combustion engines. We just want to be told, everybody sign up. What can I do? Because for my little vote, I can do miracles. I know I can. I know you all can. And that's where, but your question was really, how do we reach the people who don't know and don't care? Guess what? We don't need them. We'll save them without them caring. Because the ones who care can do it all. It's just a little buzzy. But it's not your fault. I'm certain it's the technology and not you. But the other, yeah. Technology over there, control room, buzzing. Why don't you come to the front and use this mic? Do you mind? Go try it again. He's fixed fuzz with it there.
Try, pull one over from the side there.
Which one?
Right here. Just take any of those.
Okay. Turn off the other one and it'll be clearer. Sorry about this, folks.
Yeah, this is still everything to voices. That didn't work. Come up forward. Okay, speak up on your own.
Well, if we can get him to talk into a mic, then he can be heard up.
It will democratize the. You're not shy.
4 years ago, I decided to use the courts and work with lawyers around the world and tons of groups to do what I can. And the courts have stepped up to the plate constantly, and the politicians are failed. What motivated me, though, was a post from The Guardian. So this is a group of people in England looking around the world at what the problem is around climate change. And they said this, and I would like to hear more, way much more about this topic than I've heard tonight, which is nothing, not a criticism, but it's a serious concern. The human rights of Indigenous people in Canada and our support for them will determine the fate of the planet. Now, if people in England can see that truth from way over across the ocean, we're standing here in Treaty 4, we're standing in the Governance Center, and I haven't heard a single word about or from Indigenous people, original culture people, who know how to get along with Mother Nature. We don't need to reinvent anything. What we need to do is put aside our arrogance and give voice to those people who know how to live in harmony on this planet. And so I'd like to hear your comments, because I don't care about the politicians. What I'm nervous about and terrified about is I do not hear us empowering in terms of telling us and teaching us how to survive. I don't hear Indigenous voices.
I appreciate the question. I hear a lot of Indigenous voices, and I believe that respecting the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, the Green Party is the only party that has, at our conventions, we had a resolution to renounce the doctrine of discovery, to recognize that in decolonializing Canada, we have to indigenize, which means that we can learn a great deal from making decisions to the seventh generation, as the Iroquois Confederacy said we must, that we actually have to think about how we go about what we're committed to doing, which is repealing the Indian Act, which would mean a recognition of relationship to land that comes from Indigenous law and not from colonial law, which was described by Chief Beverly McLaughlin in the unanimous decision in the Chilcotin decision as land ownership is in Indigenous law, collective and intergenerational. We would not be in the mess we're in now if instead of colonizing and oppressing Indigenous peoples who were here first, we just tried to fit in and follow their laws. We would have collective and Indigenous, collective and intergenerational recognition of territory. So I apologize, you're right, it wasn't part of what I was discussing. I think it's embedded in everything we're talking about is getting into right relationship with Mother Earth and recognizing that we do not have the right as one species to wipe out the other species that are our relatives. So when I know from any First Nations Indigenous reading in any one of the multiple nations in which I've worked and known elders, that we end with all my relations. I think that's literally true. As a member of Parliament for Saanich Gulf Islands, I often tell my constituents, I know that I'm here representing the human beings in Saanich Gulf Islands as well. In the Sechauffan language from the area that I represent, if you translate human beings, it's the human people. If you translate from Sechauffan the salmon, it's the salmon people. And if you translate whales, it's the whale people. So I recognize that my obligation as a member of Parliament for Saanich Gulf Islands is to represent the people, the whales, the salmon, the eagles, the trees, because without right relation with our Creator and creation, we are hooped. So I appreciate you raising it, and I feel awkward speaking in Treaty 4 as a non-Indigenous settler culture person. I'd be very happy to recognize someone with an authentic Indigenous voice for a comment and for raising it further. I'm grateful for your comments. I would say, by the way, there's been a pronounced engagement of Inuit, Métis, and First Nations involvement in the negotiation of climate treaties. I work a lot with Natan Obed, who's the president of the Inuit T'Pirasat-Katanami. Various other Indigenous leaders from Canada played a big role in making sure the Paris Agreement specifically stresses the importance of Indigenous science and Indigenous knowledge. So, yay. Stay where you are. This will stretch. See if I can get right to. Whoops, I moved this far.
Okay. Maybe I'll just go up there.
Namaskaman. Maskivi Maswa Wasis. I'd like to welcome everyone to our territory here of the Nehewa people. The Nehewa people, since time immemorial, have signed treaty here in this particular area. And climate, to us, is a part of our way of life. This way of life that we come to understand through mirroring our environment, understanding where we've come from. When we pray, when we look at each other, when we have the 7 sacred laws, the things that crawl, the things that fly, there's 7 sacred laws that encapsulates our being and the symbioticness of all beings on Mother Earth, including yourself. The root of where you come from as beings, the traditional values that you have from Europe, the pagan values that you once had, these are still strong within your communities in Europe. When you sit on our land in our treaty territories, we look at this industrial revolution as a mental illness that is struck across our land, and we're still dealing with it, the cause and effect of it. Since our people in time immemorial knew how the symbiotic being needs to be, if you understand quantum physics, quantum computing, and quantum mechanics, you'll understand the symbiotic understanding of science. The Munya have starting to understand it now, but I think it's a little too late. We need to move a lot more quicker. Our children are depending on you. If you do not take this seriously, we are coming to a precipice that has been foretold by our people. It is happening now. Whether or not you want to debate it with all these other people here, that is your choice. We have to live with it. Our people have been noticing this change for quite a long time. When you live with the land, you understand what the land gives back to you. Where the fish run, where the deer run. This has always been like this. When we do not see the salmon swim anymore, we do not see the caribou run anymore, when we see moose in our territories, right now, there is a polar shift happening. There is something happening and our people have noticed it. When we look at the bigger picture of humanity, there is a responsibility that we have to take. Our people, when we were silenced through the dogmatic acts and regulations of the state of Canada, silenced our voice, took away our inheritedness to care for Mother Earth and to teach the people that live with Mother Earth their responsibilities to it. When you took away our responsibilities to our mother and acted like our mother, the grassroots people as the children, you took away what was needed, which was wisdom of this territory and of our Mother Earth. Thousands of years of wisdom in which we developed our own sense of self. You took that away. Now we're paying the price because of it. And it is evident in all of these different industrial revolution programs. The one thing that we have to do is teach government. Government has a responsibility to the people. Our own government, our First Nations government, are now learning this in the past 50 years. Remember, in 1950, we couldn't vote as Indigenous people. We couldn't have a lawyer under the state Canada government. We couldn't look into the future and say, there's a train coming, stop, listen, and be aware of this. But now we're here. The First Nations have now come in full circle again. It is time to listen to our elders. The QVEA.CA, the Nahiwa people of this area, this is what we listen to all the time. Since time immemorial, there's been a divide, a racial divide. And because of this racial divide, the mental illness gets worse. Thinking that we can solve things through science. Thinking we can solve things through government. It takes your mind, your spirit, and body to be willing. It is a collectiveness that has to happen. Whether you're white, yellow, purple, orange, we're coming to a precipice. We need to act together. We need to see this as one problem. I'd like to thank the Green Party for stepping up and being here in our territory. Unfortunately, there's not enough Nahiwa people or our people here to voice their opinion. but I've been at many of these different conferences like this, or meetings, where it's the same thing. Money, greed, mental illness drives the force. We truly have to start to think as one species. If we don't, we're not going to survive. That is the truth. Thanks, Dave. Oma.
Deeply indebted for that. Mama, my wish.
All my relatives, when I just in saying that, acknowledging you as relatives, there's already a different level of respect than if I were to just say hello. Coming here tonight and listening to everything has me moved, of course. Probably going to be a little bit emotional, but that is just the nature of my work. So I consider myself an educator of sorts. I am a cultural artist, and I do a lot of work in schools talking about, the original relationship to the land and how important that it is that we all go back to that original relationship. So when somebody mentioned, how do we motivate people? How do we inspire people? There is that relationship. That broken relationship still exists. It's strong in some places, it's less in other places, and we have to acknowledge that not everybody is at the same level of understanding this relationship. And when I spend a lot of time with kids, I spend a lot of time with youth, and for me, they know what's right and they know what's wrong. They feel it in their hearts. And one of the things I often acknowledge is that the older we are, the longer we have lived with concepts, we've lived with ideas, and then the whole saying, it's hard to teach an old dog new tricks, right? And so I spend a lot of time working with the kids to teach them about that original relationship to the land. And I hear a lot about it's hard to bring culture into classrooms, it's hard to bring, all these different kinds of teachings and understandings, but when it was mentioned, our relationship to the land, and the only story that I can kind of really come to is the story of reconciliation, and that's another topic that's huge in our country, trying to repair this relationship. But same thing, there's a relationship with Mother Earth that we are all responsible for. And I always tell the kids it's probably the last truest existing relationship with Mother Earth that hasn't been interrupted as deeply as others. So when I think of moving forward or just our role, the Earth is a relative. In our own saying, we are all related. We can love the Earth that way, and that's basically the topic that's the hardest, is to explain love to people. Because our idea of love has turned into be defined by things and objects and power, when really it's just a level of respect. And teaching the kids that you can love things that don't speak to you, like plants. You can love the animals. You can love the sky. You can love the weather, and let it just be love. And there was when I was sitting in my seat over there and I was listening, there's so many things I wanted to say, and they're actually it's kind of hard to kind of bring it all together. But as a First Nations person, there are days where I find it really hard to do my work. And whether it's because of the energy, the momentum of racism that's in the media or in the area, and then there are days where it's really powerful when people are just open to learning and understanding and applying everything that they've experienced into greatness and into helping the greater good. And, you know, I love that every day that I work, I get to remind the kids of that original relationship to the land. You don't have to be anything to love the earth. You can just respect it in a good way. And, you know, when somebody mentioned, you know, where are the First Nations people? To be honest, like sometimes it is hard to get into places. Like when I came in tonight, the first thing I looked for was a First Nation person, and the first person I saw was Elder Greg Sandy over there, and I went to shake his hand. So, you know, when you know you're connected to something and you walk in, you look for that relationship or connectedness, and you know, teaching people how to do that. That's probably going to be the way, teaching people to understand that we have a connectedness to the earth and to believe in it. You know, that we don't have to wait for somebody to give us proof. You know, we can already believe that the relationship is there and that it's impacting the world. So, we got to us.
Can I ask your name? If you said it before, I didn't hear it because your mic wasn't quite working.
Holly.
Yeah, well, Holly and Toby and Elder Sandy and everybody from here who's welcomed us not into your territory but into your governance center. It's really humbling. And we are related. And we have to know this. We have to recognize in each other's eyes family. A definition of reconciliation that I particularly liked from a friend of mine who used to be president of the Council of the Haida Nation, Miles Richardson, who says reconciliation is when you look at me, you see me as I see myself, and when I look at you, I see you as you see yourself, which means the challenge of reconciliation is not kind of, you know, solving the way a lot of times in politics the debate is as if, well, now we'll discuss environmental issues and they're this silo over here. Now we'll talk about indigenous issues and they're this silo over here. But really when we recognize that when we talk about reconciliation, the burden is primarily on settler culture Canadians to understand what it means of 150 years of oppression and colonialism and actually be committed to changing the country entirely for settler culture Canadians, for Indigenous peoples, changing our culture entirely to be indigenized. I've said it before, but I mean, when we really think about it, it's like I get so excited. I think, okay, we can actually have a country that begins to move in a direction. New Zealand's got a bit of a head start. In New Zealand, by the way, the Maori representation in their House of Commons exactly equals the population of Maori in the country. It's a very interesting, and there's more politicians in New Zealand speak more Maori, but they're unlike Canada, they're dealing with one indigenous culture and one indigenous people, the Maori. We've got hundreds of languages we need to learn, and we have to protect language, protect culture, and recognize that if we can adopt that fundamental ethic that we're all related, regardless of species, regardless of color, we're all related, and the earth is our mother. If we talk in that language, some people will look at us as if we're, you know, not very modern, not good at money. But we're the ones who, and following the leadership of Indigenous knowledge, is our way as settler culture people to get to someplace safe. So I can't tell you how much I appreciate you speaking up in this space, Holly. It really is very powerful. Especially a young woman Indigenous speaker. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Just to share one more story.
Yeah.
One of the things, I've been working in diverse areas of all over Canada. We've been doing presentations on culture, and you know, I found that in our education system, you know, we're learning so much about other cultures, but we haven't been really taught a way to organize and parallel that information so it's all similarities. I find that in the practice that I do and what I do in having a common cultural conversation with kids, and pointing out looking at our similarities rather than our differences, and you know, because we can learn, like you mentioned, you know, trying to put culture into organizations. You know, it's more than just, you know, adding a token act. You know, like, okay, we're going to switch, or we're going to open with a prayer. You know, it's believing in all of those things, that all of those things are part of the whole process and a whole way of being. And so when I go into the classroom, I talk about the 6 common elements of all cultures. And, you know, every culture has their own relationship with the environment. You know, just that when I talk about it, it sounds more indigenous because I give indigenous examples, you know, and but there's a lot of common elements in all cultures that we can acknowledge. And I find that the conversation I get to have in the classroom really opens eyes, and it's something I wish I could influence at higher levels. Just to look at culture that way instead of just looking at all these little items on how, instead of just things to do, right? It's a belief system, and so you have to believe that all those items that you're bringing into your organization are powerful too, in relation to everything else. But
Thank you. Good.
First of all, I'd like to say thank you to the Qu'Appelle Valley Environmental Association for putting this event on tonight. Thank you to Elizabeth May. I have to admit this is the first time I've heard you. Thank you for coming here. Something you said in the opening, that the environmental question was very important right under the question of nuclear war. Why I'm making that reference is I think today we're in a very dangerous situation because many Western governments, including our own, have a neo-colonialist foreign policy based on robbing from the third world countries. So we are seeing country after country where the U.S. and Canada goes in to take over, especially if the people of those countries are trying to solve their own problems. So we could talk about Libya, and I was very pleased when you stood up in the Parliament all by yourself to say what was planned for Libya was not right. And I was in Libya, and I can tell you it's a hell of a mess now, thanks to the West. And we have to look at the other countries where the U.S. and Canada have gone in a similar way. What are these invasions and the overthrowing of governments going to do for the people of those countries? We could talk about Iraq, we could talk about the cost of war against Syria. Now we could look at what Canada and the U.S. doing to Venezuela. How is that going to affect the indigenous people of Venezuela and the black people of Venezuela? When I look at the pictures, I see who is supporting Maduro. It's all kinds of colors there. When I look at the person who declared himself president, which he didn't even run in the election, his crowd is all white middle class who are upset that life was getting better for poor people. Now, and I'm not saying the government maybe made lots of mistakes. I don't vote for Trudeau, but I wouldn't want anyone coming here to tell me that he is not our Prime Minister at this time.
Yeah.
So, I think I got to get to my point here. Don't you, yeah, I can see Jim trying to give me the hint. Don't you think that if we're going to really get serious about climate crisis, we also have to have a different attitude towards other countries around the world and stop robbing them? I think the big story behind this Raybould thing in Parliament isn't that he said, she said. It's what kind of policy, international policy we have, and who is it serving? And I maintain right now it's serving big Canadian companies when it should be serving the people of Canada. If it was serving the people of Canada, then we wouldn't be planning overthrows of government just because we don't like that.
Okay. Thank you. I have to say, I don't think I've ever before been with a room full of people where someone remembers that in June 2011, I was the only member of Parliament to vote against bombing Libya. The only one. I had a lot of friends, but think about what that means about democracy and whipped votes. I had friends, particularly NDPers from Quebec, women, NDP members of Parliament from Quebec, who were whipped into voting for bombing Libya. And I remember asking John Baird across the floor, because he was our Minister of International Development. At that point, it was called DFAT-D. I don't even want to try to remember, Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade Development, I think. And I said, but you're recognizing as the official government of Libya a group of people who include Al-Qaeda forces. You're recognizing a group of opposition to Gaddafi that includes terrorist organizations. What kind of government can it be that you're recognizing in place? And I was trying to get them to agree to have negotiations and UN peacekeeping forces to keep the warehouses full of armaments that Gaddafi had stored from being, and what happened, of course, is the warehouses full of armaments were opened up and went to fuel all kinds of terrorism around the world, and including the creation of ISIS. But John Baird said to me, well, we may not know what government will follow in Libya, but we can be sure it can't be worse than Muammar Gaddafi. In hindsight, not such a smart answer. So yes, we do need to change our relationship of colonialism and oppression towards other countries around the world. We should not interfere. I believe in the emerging doctrine of responsibility to protect. So that if a government is killing its own people, then we have a responsibility to try to protect people who are being killed by their own government. That would have applied to protecting the people of Syria, but we didn't go in because we had so contaminated the doctrine of responsibility to protect by using it as a shield to go into Libya with the full intent of regime change. So we have destroyed the legitimacy, at least for the near term, of being able to use responsibility to protect innocent people from despotic regimes that are killing them. And we were all too willing to go into Libya. We left Syria alone, and now we want to go into Venezuela with a far less compelling case, which would be supporting UN negotiations to get all parties to the table with a focus on helping the people of Venezuela and not assuming that we have any role in replacing one leader with another. So I appreciate you raising it. It's been really hard in Parliament to raise this issue, but when I think of all the things that happened by the dictatorial tyrant of Syria that we left, there have been hundreds of thousands of people killed, and we stood back and did nothing because we had so destroyed the responsibility to protect by what we did in Libya. Which now, of course, that brings us to this SNC-Lavalin scandal of what it took to take tens of millions of dollars to, they're alleged, we have to remember they're alleged until it's proven in court, to have bribed Muammar Gaddafi, provided prostitutes to his son, all in aid of getting a contract for building a prison in Libya in collaboration with the US government. That's not the Canada we want to see in the world. So thank you for raising it. And there's one last question, because then we're going to have to go into it, and I'll try to give a very short answer.
Thanks very much. This has been a really informative and inspirational evening. With the projected extremes in precipitation from global warming, including prolonged drought, the increasing industrialization of water is a huge concern. So I have two questions. What do you think are the most critical steps our governments need to take to protect our water? And what do you think of the Trudeau government's response to Harper's deregulating of this watershed and watersheds across the country?
The first thing to say is one good thing that happened in the Parliament when Harper was Prime Minister is we did pass a law that bans bulk water exports from transboundary basins. So it's a partial step, but it's a good one. I think we need to have an environmental bill of rights. We need to look at the countries around the world, like Bolivia and Pachamama, places that have said protecting the environment. In other words, not just regulating to say this is the permitting process by which we will legalize environmental damage. That's the permitting process for pollution permits as it now exists. But to actually say, as they have in many countries around the world, environment has rights. We can enforce those rights on behalf of the environment. Where did our lawyer friend go? We need to do that. Now, how do you do that? I don't want to open up the Charter of Rights and Freedoms for fear that's a constitutional process that could mire us forever. What I do want to do is have a law passed quite similar to the one that Ontario did years ago that creates an environmental bill of rights that can be enforced. But I would like to see it not just give rights to human beings, a right to safe drinking water, which is a right to clean air. That's what the Ontario Bill of Rights does. It gives human beings rights to a healthy environment. We have to give the environment rights, and so that we can go to court to say this river has rights, and we are going to protect this river, and the people who live in that watershed work along to protect the river, the forest, the southern resident killer whale, the woodland caribou, be able to protect the rights of our relatives who are non-human through a legislated environmental bill of rights is what we should be doing. Anyone who follows the Suzuki Foundation Blue Dot campaign knows what this is, to say we want to convey to our environment legally enforceable rights, and that is totally doable. We want to also recognize the right to water, and increasingly to say, and this is something I'll just end on, because it kind of brings together some of the themes here. Our society has moved in the direction of a state religion, which, and I'm going to acknowledge this comes from a friend of mine who's Buddhist, who's a professor at York University, named Peter Tierman. And he said, you know, we think we have no state religion in Canada, but we do. We worship the economy. It has its own catechism, its own liturgy, it has its priesthood, it has all the elements of our religion. We worship the economy. And going back to your comment, what Peter said is that in this religion of worshiping the economy, the central unifying virtue is selfish individualism. So I think we have to name it. And we have to start saying that's not who we are as Canadians. We believe in our communities. We believe we can do more together than we can do individually. We believe in compassion, helping each other, caring for each other, loving each other, and in that we recognize that the earth is sacred. That when we approach something for our use, we approach with reverence and thanksgiving. That we understand that while we do use the things of this earth, we cut down a tree to make a table, we're surrounded. I'd like to think that those people who went to fell those trees recognize, thank you. Now that doesn't happen very much in our culture and in our society. But the more that we recognize there's nothing wrong with an economy. There's nothing wrong with the rule. Well, we can change the rules. We made them up in the first place. We can't change the rules of the atmosphere. We can't change the rules of water flows from higher place to ocean. These are rules we can't change. We can change the rules of the economy. We can write into the rules of our economy that we factor in survival as more important than profit. And we can also recognize that when we talk about the earth, we can be brave enough to say, in a secular economist, not economist, but a society that practices economic theism of worshiping of the economy, even against the consumeristic, selfish elements of our society, we should be able to embrace it and say out loud, the earth is my mother, creation is sacred, and we are here to protect that which gave us life. Thank you.
So we have to tell the truth, including that this event, that we spent $1,000 on this event because we don't consider it ends. We live stream, and thanks to Tim for coming in and helping us. because we know people want to participate in this conversation all across the country.
None of that money was for me, just quickly adding. It cost $1,000 just to organize the event. The speaker was free. Thank you very much.
And it does cost to do these things, and we need help, so if you want to help us, you can at the back. We have a number of posters left, and I'm going to suggest if you want to take one, and if you're willing to sign them, throw in the cost of the poster, which is a toonie. But there's about 40 up there. To remind you, just to remind you of tonight. Thanks to Lorna, to Randy, to Greg. We did the bulk of the work. Florence, Sharon, postering. Help me here. Joanne, Lauder on the webpage. Scott on the camera. And if I missed you, give your name right now. About 10. It takes about 10 people to do this. We meet every second Wednesday at the Art Center. We carry on. We have a project around all the chemical load coming into this watershed. We are trying to find out just how much chemicals are going on the land. It relates to the drainage issues. It relates to the need to change how we produce food. If we want clean water and clean food, we're going to have to change the way we produce food. And climate change is going to make that challenge a bigger one for us. So you're welcome to come to those meetings. We have a web page that's filled with resources, QVEA.CA. You can scroll into it and find your way through. In particular, you might want to look at the Marsh papers. It's our research using freedom of information files on land sales in Fort Qu'Appelle that are questionable in terms of the impact of watersheds. Any other announcements?
Oh, Jim, did you say we meet every second Wednesday? We meet the second Wednesday.
Sorry, the second Wednesday. And that's Lorna who does our proofreading.
I forgot to mention, if anyone's interested in the Green Party and you want to find our policies online, I hate to admit it, our website isn't all that user-friendly. I can't imagine why, but anyway, sorry. I just want you to go, if you go to the website to look for our policies, you look for a document called Vision Green. You can find Vision Green and click on it, but if you go looking for Green Party policies, you won't find them. They're all in a document called Vision Green. So I'd love it if you investigated and decided if we had earned some of your support. But in the meantime, in a non-partisan spirit, from wherever you are, with whatever tools you have, replicate this gentleman's climate action and go to everyone you meet in every place and say, have you thought about climate change? You want to work on making the change? Come join us at the school student strike Friday, March 15th, just this week, and start supporting the students. And if I forgot to mention the name, I want you to go on YouTube. If you don't know the Swedish student who started the school student strike, find, if you have a computer, go to Google and YouTube and look for Greta Thunberg, Thunberg. She is the person I respect the most in this world for clear and honest climate messages. She has got it all together, and she's 16 years old, and she lives in Stockholm. So Greta Thunberg started the school strike movement, and you'll be inspired when you watch her videos.
If you want to be on our resource list, it's not a membership. You sign the network list, and monthly we send out material. So thanks for coming, and especially for Elizabeth to take this time to come here. Have a good night.